Okay, so now we have the housing.df data file that we have read from a CSV file, and let's now look at uh, look little bit more um, about the data. Okay, so there are some there are some code snippets, code lines that we can use to examine or just browse through the data and understand the data a little bit better. Okay, so one code is to use dim. Okay, dim. Okay, again remember, so once you type 3 letters, it's going to give you possible options. You can continue to type if the more options are prompted, so that you can narrow down to the particular option that you want to select, and then press the enter key. Right now, what dim will do is it will give you the dimension. Dim is for dimension. Okay, run that, and you see that code is that line of code has been run, and it says the first item is number of rows and the second item is number of columns. There are 5,802 observations. It's shown here as well, and 14 variables. So this is one way of looking at the size of the data set. Okay. Now, if you want to look at just the number of rows, there are two ways of doing that. One is we can say dim housing, right? Okay. Now, so now the dim housing is going to give us a kind of a matrix, right? The first item is going to be the number of rows. The second item is the number of columns. So if you start with a square bracket and say I want the first item, okay, so that's going to give us the number of rows. If you run that, it will give you the number of rows. Okay. Well, actually, if you want the number of rows, it's a lot easier to just simply say n row housing df. All right, so that will give you n rows. Okay. It's a slight difference in the way in which the number of rows is given in these two commands, but that's not material for us. So you can say in dim I want the first item, so that will give you the number of rows, or you can simply say n row. Or if you want the column, then you housing. So column is the second item, so say square bracket and 2. So that will give you the number of columns. And again, it's a lot easier to simply say n col, right? And then housing df. So that will give you the number of columns. And then there is another code that we can use if you want to just examine the first few rows of the data set. So that's called head. So if you use head, now that code will give you the first 6 rows of the data set for all the columns. So if you want to take a quick look at what the data looks like, and you don't want to see the whole thing, you just want to see the top few rows, then head is what you would use. And of course, the opposite of that, suppose if you want to look at the last few rows, you'll use for that tail. And you run that, and you see the last rows. Okay, and it gives you the row number right here. So 1 to 6, right? So here it is the last up to 5802. So the last 6 rows. Suppose we want to look at specific set of rows, right? I want, say, rows 10 to 20. Okay. Then you say housing, right? 10 colon 20. Okay. Now this is not going to work. If you run this, it's going to give you an error. That's because we have not specified when you use the square bracket for a data frame that has multiple rows and multiple columns, then you have to specify which rows and which columns. In the case of dim, it was just one row. Okay, there are only two items. So we didn't have to specify the second dimension. Whereas here, since housing has rows and columns, you have to specify both. So suppose we want rows 10 to 20, all columns. So then you say comma and you just leave the column space blank, then it'll assume will assume all columns. Okay, so if you run that, then again you see 10 to 20, okay, all columns. And you want, say, housing, you want a particular row, say row 5, and you want columns 1 to 10, right? 1 to 10. Then it'll give you just that one row, right? Row 5, columns 1 to 10. Okay. Suppose you want some specific set of columns, not contiguous. So instead of 1 to 10, you want like 1 to 2 and then the fourth one and then the 8 and 9. So in that case, you would do, okay. Now, suppose we want just row 5. Suppose if you don't specify, if you start with a comma, so that means all, since you're leaving the row space blank, the entire 5,802 rows will be printed, and we don't want that. So we want, say, only the fifth row, and we want some selected columns. When you have a selected column, so you have to give that as a list. And the list and lists in R are specified with a C. Okay, you start with a C and then specify the list that you want. Suppose we want 1 to 2, okay, comma, then we want column 4, and then we want 8 to 10. Okay. Now this will give us the selected columns in the list, okay, for row 5. We can also use name of a column for browsing. So for that, start with the data frame and then you put $sign. Once you enter a $sign, you will be prompted for the list of column names that we have in the data frame, and then you can scroll and select the column that you want. And suppose we select that column. Okay, so now there is just, we have selected just one column, right? Now if you just press enter, the entire column values will be displayed. Or you can select a particular set of values. So let's do this. So you run that, then the entire column is displayed, right? Now instead, suppose if you say, again, if you want a particular value, say the fifth value, now you do that with square bracket, right? So then you get that just that fifth value. Or you want a range of values, say 1 to 10. Then you, again, within square bracket, you do 1 colon 10. Okay. Now this dollar can be used for any, but if when you want to look at just one column, then you can do that. So now if you just put a comma and 1, what do you think we will get? So we will get, because we left the row specification blank, we did not specify any row, so the entire all the 5802 rows will be assumed, and then after the comma, since I have 1, it will be the first column, which is the total value. So if I run this, so that's what you'll get. So here, if you scroll up, so housing comma 1, so it gives you starting from 344.2. If you look at the housing DF, you see that that column is what we see. Okay, we already saw str structure. Okay, and this is very useful to get a quick look at what the variables, what the variable type, numerical, character, factor, and so on. And there is another command that we can, another code snippet, so which is class. Okay, class will tell you what type of an object, what type of an OR object it is. So if you run that, it's going to tell you that this is a data frame. All right. And then we have another one called summary. Now, summary will give you a summary of all the columns. So for all numeric columns, it will give you minimum, first quartile, median, mean, third quartile, and maximum. Okay. And then for the factor here, so it will give you how many in each. Okay, remember there are 3 possible values for remodel, factor with 3 levels, right? So how many nuns are there, how many old, how many recent. So it gives you a summary of that. So these are some useful small snippet codes that we can use to browse through the data and understand it a little bit better. Okay, now let's look at finding some statistics for specific columns, right? Suppose we want the mean of total value. So we can say mean, right? Then you specify, okay. Now since we want for the total column, I can specify that like that. Right. Then run. So it's going to give the mean. Okay. And if you want to capture that mean into a variable and then use it later on for something else, then you can say mean total value. Okay, so you can capture it. Okay, so now if you run, so here mean total value is now available to us, and we can use it in some other code snippet.